And now, the fabulously fabulous, marvelously marvelous, wonderfully wonderful science fiction theater of the imagination proudly presents Extreme Gravity, the new radio play written by J.D. Evans Jr., starring Elvis D. Tripp and his traveling troupe of strange voices, and featuring the musical stylings of Milford Whittle and his finger puppet marching band, with sua sponte silly announcements by Warfel the Potato. We continue with Chapter 5, Sinister Visitors in the Abandoned City. Not long before Bacra and Suzanne began preparing to leave another world, two protectors zoomed across the horizon over the distant mountaintops and were now watching as the occupants of a sinister-looking spaceship were preparing to leave the mysterious interior of the now oddly silent intergalactic vehicle. The immediate area around the spaceship was faintly aglow with an eerie reddish light emanating from the slowly cooling protective surface of the coal-black saucer-shaped vehicle. If these protectors had ever watched early 20th century Earth motion pictures about aliens from outer space, then this sinister-looking spaceship would have reminded them of some of the spaceships in those movies, except that this particular one was coal-black instead of the usual shiny metallic color. Hollywood screenplay writers and model builders had done an excellent job of describing and constructing many of the possible shapes used in real spaceships, but had apparently missed a few of the mechanical requirements mandated by several of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, not the least important of which clearly indicates that blasting through a life-supporting planet's atmosphere in a matter of seconds will inevitably generate an enormous quantity of heat. The protectors could see bits of activity through the viewports located along the slightly raised top of the sinister-looking spaceship, and it was apparent that something was about to happen. Mostly what the protectors observed through the viewports was a mildly agitated ballet of shadows dancing against an equally eerie reddish interior background within the sinister-looking spaceship. Some of the shadows moved very slowly and deliberately, but others started rapidly from viewport to viewport and appeared to focus their efforts on an area adjacent to two particular viewports. After the shadow ballet reached its apparent climax, there was a series of bell tones, followed by the transformation of the area adjacent to the two particular viewports into a triangular-shaped door. Just as quickly as the bell tones softly pierced the outer stillness of the moonlit night, the triangular-shaped door panels slid into their respective sides, and a rather voluminous amount of fog poured out of the sinister-looking spaceship. As the fog reached the protectors, a quick chemical analysis determined that the fog was petroleum-based, a good indication that whatever was inside the sinister-looking spaceship required considerable amounts of lubrication, but not much in the way of typically breathable atmosphere. As the oily fog cleared, the protectors began to see the outline of a coal-black sphere teetering at the edge of a triangular-shaped door. At the top of the coal-black sphere was a little box which appeared to be the cockpit of a kind of humorously grotesque terrestrial transportation vehicle that had one spherical tire instead of the usual 4 cylinder tires. The combination of a little smokestack complete with ample production of black oily smoke and a continuous clanging noise reminiscent of an overly stressed tractor engine further contributed to the somewhat alarming blend of emotions this vehicle elicited. The resulting effect was that the protectors found themselves observing an odd cacophony of high and low technology, and this observation prevented them from immediately transmitting an alarm signal back to their controllers in the stone castle. Instead, figuring that since they had not been detected by the strange visitors, they were probably safely invisible, the protectors each split into an unequal pair of protector-shaped forms, one almost the full size of each protector and the other one about 1/10 of the size of each protector. The little protectors, drones actually, were loaded with all the information each protector had observed and were programmed to return silently to the stone castle, where they were to report to the controllers and download their observational data. As these drones headed over the nearby mountaintops, the protectors continued to observe both the newly arrived visitors and the embarking of the strangely constructed terrestrial transportation vehicles from the sinister-looking spaceship. In the elapsed time since the drones had appeared and departed, the first vehicle had jumped from the triangular-shaped door to the ground and started scouting the immediate area in a way that now suggested it was performing tests to determine whether it was capable of moving across this planet's terrain. After a few minutes, whatever criteria needed to be met were satisfied, and the smoking, clanging, and strangely rolling vehicle returned to the base of the sinister-looking spaceship, where it stood guard as 5 more vehicles embarked from the sinister-looking spaceship. The protectors decided to call the smoking, clanging, and strangely rolling vehicles polyrollies, and after a few minutes there were 6 polyrollies and a considerable amount of smoking, clanging, and so forth in the area adjacent to the sinister-looking spaceship. Whatever the visitors were planning to do was requiring a bit more staging and maneuvering than one would normally expect under similar conditions. Then, almost as quickly as the visitors and their polyrollies had completed a most unorganized display of staging and maneuvering, they moved into a perfectly symmetrical polygon formation and began illuminating the polygon and a pathway into the sinister-looking spaceship with an ominous reddish light. The smoking and clanging continued, but all motion stopped, and there was an eerie silence in the air. Another series of bell tones sounded, and slowly, one by one, shadow shapes began moving from the sinister-looking spaceship down into the polygon area. There were 7 such shadow shapes, one for each of the polyrollies, and one who appeared to be the leader. In the next few minutes, each shadow carefully examined the exterior of its respective polyrolly, and the shadow leader visited and conferred with each of the other shadows. The appearance was that this was some kind of military procedure, and that the polyrollies were being inspected for their upcoming mission, while simultaneously providing some kind of apparently necessary environmental protection for the shadows. Then, after completing the inspections which the shadows felt were necessary, each shadow boarded its respective polyrolly, and the shadow leader joined the group by selecting and boarding one particular polyrolly. Boarding was accomplished by a maneuver in which the cockpit of each polyrolly rotated downward along its spherical wheel until it was in a vertical position, at which time its top opened and the respective shadow darted inside, followed by the top closing and the cockpit rotating upward to its previous position directly atop the polyrolly. In the case of the command polyrolly, both the polyrolly shadow and the shadow leader boarded the cockpit. The triangular-shaped spaceship door closed. The ominous reddish light dimmed considerably, and the polyrolly formation began moving away from the sinister-looking spaceship in the direction just to the left of the protectors who were hovering inside a nearby treetop. The protectors continued watching as the polyrolly formation not so gently moved across the field next to the wooded area in which the protectors were hiding. Instead of trying to roll directly over the mountains, the polyrollies were heading toward a little valley that meandered lazily toward a gradually sloping mountain pass that eventually led to the valley on the other side of the nearby mountains. Seeing nothing particularly unusual in the actions of the polyrollies, the protectors followed them but kept a safe distance. As the polyrollies were leaving the little valley and beginning to move upward along the gradually sloping mountain pass, the drones, now accompanied by 2 more protectors, returned and exchanged information with the first pair of protectors, who once again loaded the drones with newly observed information and sent them back to the stone castle. The only instructions the drones brought from the stone castle were for the protectors carefully to continue observing the visitors. While the first pair of protectors continued following the Polyrollies, the second newly arrived pair of protectors found a convenient treetop location and began observing the sinister-looking spaceship, which at the moment was doing nothing in particular. After a rather long and arduous journey through the gradually sloping mountain pass, the Polyrollies formed a single-line formation and stopped just at the crest of the mountain path leading downward to the valley next to the stone castle. The next series of events happened very quickly and almost startled the protectors into exposing their presence. The Polyrollies increased the speed of their clanging noises and similarly increased the output of black, holy smoke from their smokestacks, and then immediately began moving down the mountain pass at a quite alarming speed. In a matter of seconds, the Polyrollies were halfway across the valley that led to the stone castle, and in a few more seconds, the Polyrollies were at the moat that surrounded the stone castle. Instead of stopping and preparing some kind of ramp for crossing the moat, the Polyrollies just kept on heading directly for the stone castle, and all but one of them made it across the moat. The Polyrollie that didn't get across the moat increased the spinning of its single spherical wheel and forced itself across the water and up the nearby bank, accompanied by a significant flurry of water, smoke, and clanging. And just as quickly as the Polyrollies had formed a single-line formation at the crest of the mountain pass, they were now all inside the courtyard of the stone castle, where they had moved into another perfectly symmetrical formation around the reflection pool that was filled with a liquid which looked more like velvet black oil than water. Over the next few minutes, one by one, each Polyrollie retracted and closed its smokestack and moved into the velvet black oil of the reflection pool. This was a very slow, almost religiously precise set of actions. When all the Polyrollies were in the reflection pool, they submerged and began moving downward toward the center of the abandoned city, where there were other similar reflection pools. Simultaneously, the castle protectors were monitoring the Polyrollies as they slowly moved through the tunnels that led from the courtyard and the reflection pool downward to the center of the abandoned city. Of greatest concern to the protectors was the presence of a reflection pool in their control area, deep within the heart of the abandoned city, and the protectors were frantically constructing a wall that, it was hoped, would hide them from the Polyrollies if they decided to travel to this particular reflection pool. It was now apparent to the castle protectors that the Polyrollies and the shadow drivers had been in the abandoned city before. It was also apparent that the Polyrollies were less concerned about being discovered within the stone castle in the abandoned city than they were concerned about being confronted in the valley leading to the stone castle. While some of the castle protectors continued frantically constructing the wall that might be able to conceal their control area, others continued searching the old records looking for information about the visitors, their sinister-looking spaceship, the shadows, and the Polyrollies. As the first Polyrollie had submerged into the velvet black oil of the courtyard reflection pool, Phrog the Munificent had begun checking the primary tunnel leading down through the inside of the stone castle toward the deep room, located several miles beneath the abandoned city. As far as Phrog was concerned, nobody was supposed to know of the existence of this particular deep room. But as he often thought, one never knows, does one? In any event, doing a bit of reconnaissance would be a pleasant distraction from the annoyance of having to travel in a shadow wheel, no matter how diligently the shadows had endeavored to make the journey comfortable. Phrog continued his reconnaissance as the other shadow wheels had submerged and then had started following him slowly downward into the primary tunnel. Nothing in Phrog's monitors looked unusual, and Phrog found some assurance in looking at the data shown on the monitors. Once enough data was gathered, Phrog pressed a few of the buttons, and the central monitor displayed a three-dimensional map of the primary tunnel and its immediate branches. The transfer media was well maintained, and now that Phrog could smell traces of it in the shadow wheel's atmosphere, he became less agitated. Clearly, nothing had been in this tunnel for a long time, but if something had been in the tunnel, Phrog would have known immediately just by smelling the transfer media. A quick check of the other shadow wheels ascertained that Phrog's novices were safely asleep in their protective pods. If this deep room were still functioning, then Phrog could complete their training and there would be 5 new pilots. If not, then he would try another deep room and would hopefully find one that was functioning before the pods opened. If none were found, he would at least have a crew, but having pilots was much better. Nevertheless, as Phrog often thought, one never knows, does one? In order to be pilots, his novices must be exposed to a deep room while still in their pods. This was important because it activated certain characteristics in the novices that were necessary for them to become pilots. Mostly it was a matter of exposing the novices to isolated time threads. And in this part of the galaxy, a deep room was the only way individual time threads could be sufficiently isolated. Once the novices recognized an individual time thread, the necessary changes in their perceptual skills would occur, and they would be prepared to become pilots. With 5 pilots augmenting his own prowess as a pilot, Phrog would be able to travel easily through more dimensions and consequently carry more volume. Being able to carry more volume was important because biologicals were unknowingly voluminous, and in his business, biologicals were where the wealth was. Phrog was a conglomerate of sorts, traveler, farmer, but mostly thief and pirate. His business was supplying the yarn tongue picks with interesting life forms for their planetary zoos, and Phrog had discovered this galaxy along with its quite entertaining life forms several centuries ago. At first, business was excellent, and Phrog had little difficulty capturing and delivering his unique assortment of life forms. But as time progressed, the delivery aspects of his business became increasingly difficult, probably because of shifts in the time threads combined with his increasing age and somewhat dull perception. Phrog was still an excellent pilot, but he needed the edge he would gain by having 5 young pilots augmenting his perception of the time threads. Of course, Phrog knew this would be necessary, and it was one of the reasons he had prepared several deep rooms in scattered locations throughout this galaxy. Getting 5 novices was more difficult, but Phrog was as skilled at bargaining as he was in his other trades. The families were amply paid, and the novices would be returned after an appropriately long period of indenture, most likely as fully trained pilots. Such was the agreement between the families and him. But as Phrog often thought, one never knows, does one? Phrog continued monitoring the journey through the tunnels, occasionally checking the status of the other shadow wheels and the novices within. In less time than one might imagine, the shadow wheels began getting closer to the deep room, and Phrog increased his reconnaissance of the tunnels and the area surrounding the deep room. At several branch tunnels along the way, slowly downward toward the deep room, Phrog noticed various kinds of activity just outside the tunnel area, but it was not representative of any of the life forms he knew about, and it appeared to be part of the security presence they who came before had left behind when they, most annoyingly, discovered how to use the world windows, and then, even more annoyingly, had used them to leave his wonderful little abandoned city, as he was now forced to call it. Phrog had detected just a hint of some interesting life forms as his spaceship blasted through the sky and headed toward the other side of the mountains, but business could wait until he finished training the novices. At the moment, pilots were considerably more important to Phrog than any other life form. And thus ends the 5th chapter of Extreme Gravity, Sinister Visitors in the Abandoned City, the new radio play written by J.D. Evans Jr., starring Elvis D. Tripp, and featuring the musical stylings of Milford Whittle and his finger puppet marching band, with sua sponte silly announcements by Warfel the Potato. Stay tuned for the next chapter in Extreme Gravity. Bakra and Suzanne discover a secret. This has been presented to you by the fabulously fabulous, marvelously marvelous, wonderfully wonderful science fiction theater of the imagination. I'm Warfel the Potato. Good night.